Before we begin this story, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what you think will happen next. Enjoy the story. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the exclusive rooftop restaurant, each drop creating rivulets that distorted the glittering city lights 30 floors below. Inside the opulent dining room, crystal chandeliers cast warm light over marble tables draped in white silk, where the city's elite dined on plates worth more than most people's monthly salaries. The soft murmur of refined conversation mixed with the gentle clink of champagne glasses, creating an atmosphere of understated luxury that money alone could buy. Grace Parker moved between the tables with practiced grace, her black uniform pristine, despite having worked a double shift. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and though exhaustion tugged at her features, she maintained the professional smile that had kept her employed at Skyline for 3 years. Few people looked at her directly. To the wealthy patrons, waitstaff were invisible, merely extensions of the restaurant's impeccable service. She approached table 12, where a lone figure sat staring out at the storm. Even seated, his commanding presence was undeniable. Alexander Cain, the youngest billionaire CEO in the city, whose face graced magazine covers and financial headlines with equal frequency. His dark suit was perfectly tailored, his black hair styled with casual precision. But tonight, something was different. His usual aura of unshakable confidence seemed fractured, replaced by a tension that made Grace's steps falter. "Would you like to order, Mr. Cain?" she asked softly, her voice barely audible above the rain. He turned, and Grace found herself caught in the intensity of his steel blue eyes. For a moment, neither spoke. Alexander had dined here countless times, but he had never really seen her before. Tonight, however, her gentle presence seemed to cut through the chaos in his mind like a beacon in the storm. "Actually," he said, his deep voice rough with exhaustion, "I need your help with something far more important than dinner." Grace blinked, confusion flickering across her delicate features. "I'm sorry, sir. I don't understand." Alexander glanced around the nearly empty restaurant, then back at her. The desperation in his eyes made her heart skip. "My grandfather is dying. He has one condition for me to inherit the company that's been our family legacy for 4 generations. I have to be married by midnight tonight, or everything goes to my cousin Marcus, a man who will destroy everything my family built." Grace's eyes widened. I'm very sorry about your grandfather, but I don't see how I can help." "My fiancée left me at the altar this morning," Alexander continued, his voice cracking slightly. "Said she couldn't marry someone who cared more about business than love. The media had a field day. Every eligible woman in the city knows about the humiliation. No one will marry me now, not even for money." The rain intensified, thunder rolling across the sky like an ominous drumbeat. Grace set down her order pad, her professional composure wavering. "Mr. Cain, surely there must be someone." "There's no one," he interrupted, standing abruptly. His tall frame towered over her, but his eyes held vulnerability rather than intimidation. "Grace, I've watched you work here for months. You're kind, genuine, everything this world seems to lack. I know this sounds insane, but I'm begging you." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box, dropping to one knee, right there in the middle of the restaurant. The few remaining diners turned to stare, their conversations dying into stunned silence. Grace's hands flew to her mouth, her green eyes wide with shock. "Kiss me now, or I lose everything," Alexander said, his voice breaking with desperation. "Marry me tonight, and I'll give you anything you want. $1 million, 10 million, your own house, your mother's medical bills paid. Anything." Grace stared down at him, her mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. Billionaires didn't propose to waitresses in public restaurants, but the raw pain in his eyes was unmistakably real. "Mr. Cain, Please," he whispered, loud enough for only her to hear. "I know you don't love me. I know this is crazy. But if you say no, my grandfather's life work dies with him. 60 years of building something meaningful, gone to a man who sees it as nothing but profit margins." Grace's heart hammered against her ribs. Around them, other diners held their breath, phones already out to capture the moment. The silence stretched taut as violin strings. She thought of her mother's cancer treatments, the bills that kept coming, the second job she'd been considering just to stay afloat. But more than that, she thought of the genuine anguish in this powerful man's voice. "If I say yes," she whispered, her voice trembling, "what happens after midnight?" Alexander's eyes softened. "We can annul it immediately if you want, or we can figure it out as we go. I'm not asking for love, Grace. I'm asking for a chance." The clock on the wall showed 11:30 p.m., 30 minutes to change both their lives forever. Grace looked down at him, this titan of industry reduced to a man on his knees, and felt something shift inside her chest. Maybe it was compassion. Maybe it was the champagne the kitchen staff had been sneaking her all night. Or maybe it was the way he'd remembered her name when no one else ever had. "Get up," she said softly. Alexander's face crumpled, resignation flooding his features as he began to rise. "I understand. I'm sorry for putting you in this position." "You misunderstood," Grace interrupted, stepping closer until they were mere inches apart. Her voice was steady now, decision made. "I said get up because I can't kiss you properly when you're on the floor." The restaurant erupted in gasps and whispers as Alexander rose slowly, disbelief and hope warring in his expression. Grace reached for his face with trembling hands, her fingers barely grazing his jawline, before he captured her lips in a kiss that stole her breath completely. The world around them disappeared, the staring diners, the flashing phone cameras, even the storm raging outside. There was only the warmth of his mouth on hers and the thundering of her heart. When they finally broke apart, Alexander rested his forehead against hers, his voice a rough whisper. "Are you sure about this?" Grace nodded, though her entire body shook with the magnitude of what she'd just agreed to. "I'm sure. But we need to hurry if we're going to beat midnight." Alexander's face transformed with relief and something deeper, gratitude that made Grace's chest tighten. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands. "Marcus?" "Yes, it's me. I need the judge ready at the courthouse in 20 minutes. Yes, I know what time it is. Just make it happen." As he made the call, Grace's manager approached with wide eyes and a nervous expression. "Grace, I don't know what's happening here, but your shift isn't over." "She doesn't work here anymore," Alexander said firmly, ending his call and wrapping a protective arm around Grace's waist. The gesture sent unexpected warmth through her entire body. "As of right now, Miss Parker is otherwise engaged." Grace looked around the restaurant that had been her second home for 3 years, at the co-workers who were staring with mixtures of shock and envy. Everything was changing so fast, she could barely process it. "I need to get my things from the locker." "Whatever you need, we'll replace," Alexander said gently. "But we have 18 minutes to get to the courthouse, and traffic in this storm." He trailed off, but his meaning was clear. Grace nodded, her practical nature overriding her shock. "Then let's go." Alexander's driver was waiting with a sleek black car that probably cost more than Grace's annual salary. As they settled into the leather seats, Grace finally had a moment to truly comprehend what she'd done. She was sitting next to a man worth billions, wearing a waitress uniform, about to marry him in what had to be the most impulsive decision of her life. "Second thoughts?" Alexander asked quietly, noticing her paler. Grace turned to study his profile as he stared out at the city racing past. Even in the dim light of the car, she could see the exhaustion etched in his features, the weight he carried on his shoulders. "Tell me about your grandfather." A soft smile crossed Alexander's lips, the first genuine warmth she'd seen from him all evening. "Henry Cain. He started the company with nothing but a small loan and an unshakable belief that business should serve people, not the other way around. He built homeless shelters, funded schools, created jobs in communities that had been forgotten. When I was growing up, he used to say that wealth without purpose was just hoarding." "And your cousin Marcus?" Alexander's expression hardened. "Marcus sees the company as an ATM. He's already made it clear he plans to sell off the charitable divisions, lay off thousands of workers, and focus solely on profit maximization. Everything my grandfather spent his life building would be gutted within a year." Grace felt a pang of understanding. "That's why this matters so much to you." "It's not just about the money," Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's about honoring his legacy. He raised me after my parents died, taught me that real power comes from lifting others up, not standing on their backs." The courthouse came into view, its imposing columns barely visible through the rain. Grace's palms were sweating now, the reality of the situation hitting her full force. "Alexander, I need you to know something. I'm not doing this for the money." He turned to her, surprise flickering in his eyes. "Then why?" Grace took a deep breath, searching for words to explain something she barely understood herself. "Because in 3 years of serving your table, you never once treated me like I was invisible. You said please and thank you. You asked how my day was going. And tonight, when you could have demanded or tried to buy me, you asked. You said please." She paused, her voice softening. "Maybe that seems small to you, but kindness is rare in your world." Alexander stared at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. "Grace Parker," he said quietly, "I think I'm beginning to understand why my grandfather would have approved of you." The car stopped, and Grace could see Judge Harrison waiting under an umbrella by the courthouse steps, looking thoroughly disgruntled about being roused at nearly midnight. This was it. In just a few minutes, she would either be married to a man she barely knew, or watching him lose everything that mattered to him. "One more question," Grace said, as Alexander reached for the door handle. "After midnight, after you've saved the company, what happens to us?" Alexander paused, his hand frozen on the door. When he looked at her, his eyes held a vulnerability that made her breath catch. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'd like to find out if you're willing." Grace nodded, her decision already made. "Then let's go get married, Mr. Cain." They ran through the rain hand in hand, their laughter mixing with the thunder as they raced toward a future neither of them could have imagined just hours ago. Behind them, the city glittered through the storm, unaware that 2 lives were about to change forever in the space of a few whispered vows. As they reached the courthouse steps, Grace caught sight of the clock tower in the distance. 11:47 p.m. 13 minutes to save an empire and possibly discover something neither of them had been looking for. Something that felt suspiciously like the beginning of love. Judge Harrison was a stern-faced man in his 70s who clearly wasn't pleased about conducting a midnight wedding ceremony. But the substantial donation Alexander had promised to the courthouse renovation fund had secured his cooperation. The judge's chambers were dimly lit, smelling of old leather and coffee, with law books lining every wall and rain pattering steadily against the single window. "This is highly irregular," Judge Harrison muttered, shuffling through papers, while occasionally glancing at Grace's waitress uniform and Alexander's rain-dampened suit. "I hope you both understand the seriousness of marriage vows," regardless of the circumstances that brought you here. Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks. Standing in this formal setting, the gravity of what they were doing hit her like a physical blow. She was about to marry a complete stranger. Yes, she'd served him coffee and taken his orders for 3 years. But she knew nothing real about him beyond his preference for black coffee and medium-rare steaks. "Do you have rings?" the judge asked, adjusting his glasses. Alexander reached into his pocket and pulled out the velvet box from the restaurant. Inside was a stunning diamond ring that caught the lamplight and threw rainbows across the chamber walls. Grace gasped. She hadn't gotten a proper look at it during the chaos at the restaurant. "It was my grandmother's," Alexander said quietly, his voice gentle as he took her trembling hand. "She would have liked you." The ring slid onto Grace's finger perfectly, as if it had been meant for her all along. The weight of it felt surreal, a tangible reminder that this wasn't a dream or an elaborate joke. She was actually doing this. "And for the groom," Judge Harrison prompted. Grace's heart sank. Of course, they'd need 2 rings, and she had nothing to offer. Her own jewelry consisted of a simple watch and small stud earrings her mother had given her for graduation. "I don't have—" "Actually," Alexander interrupted, reaching into his other pocket. He pulled out a simple gold band that looked well-worn and meaningful. "This was my grandfather's. He gave it to me when I turned 18, said I should save it for when I found someone worth building a life with." Grace stared at him in amazement. "Are you sure? This seems too important." "It's perfect," Alexander said firmly, and the sincerity in his voice made her hands shake as she slipped the ring onto his finger. Judge Harrison cleared his throat. "Very well. Do you, Alexander Cain, take Grace Parker to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse? Until death do you part?" Alexander's eyes never left Grace's face. "I do." "And do you, Grace Parker, take Alexander Cain to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part. Grace's voice caught in her throat. The words seemed to echo in the small chamber, carrying weight she hadn't expected. This was supposed to be a business arrangement, a favor to help a desperate man save his family legacy. But looking into Alexander's eyes, seeing the hope and vulnerability there, she felt something shift inside her chest. "I do," she whispered. "By the power vested in me by the state, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." The clock on Judge Harrison's desk read 11:59 p.m. as Alexander stepped closer, his hands gentle as they framed Grace's face. "Thank you," he breathed against her lips before kissing her with a tenderness that made her knees weak. The clock chimed midnight just as they broke apart, and Grace saw Alexander's shoulders sag with relief. They'd done it. Whatever happened next, He'd saved his grandfather's company from destruction. "Congratulations," Judge Harrison said dryly, though his expression had softened slightly. "Mrs. Cain, Mr. Cain, may your marriage bring you both happiness, regardless of how it began." Mrs. Cain. Grace Parker was now Grace Cain, wife of a billionaire, wearing a diamond ring worth more than her family's house. The surreal nature of it all made her laugh, a slightly hysterical sound that echoed off the chamber walls. "Are you all right?" Alexander asked, concern flickering across his features. "I think I'm in shock," Grace admitted, staring down at her ring. 6 hours ago, I was worried about whether I'd have enough tips to pay for groceries this week. Now I'm married to you." Alexander's expression grew serious. "Grace, I want you to know that nothing has to change if you don't want it to. We can keep this purely business. You can have your own apartment, your own life." "Alexander," Grace interrupted, placing her hand on his arm. The gesture felt natural despite everything. "Can we figure this out as we go? Like you said in the restaurant?" Relief flooded his features. "Yes, absolutely, yes." Judge Harrison handed them the marriage certificate, officially sealed and signed. "I suggest you both get some rest. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." As they left the courthouse, the storm was beginning to clear, revealing patches of starlit sky between the clouds. Alexander's driver was waiting patiently, and Grace realized she had no idea where they were going next. "Your place or mine?" Alexander asked, with a wry smile that made Grace's heart skip. "I live in a studio apartment above a Chinese restaurant," Grace said, suddenly self-conscious. "I'm guessing your place is slightly more spacious." "Slightly," Alexander agreed, his eyes twinkling. "But Grace, if you'd prefer your own space tonight, I completely understand. We can take this as slowly as you need." Grace considered this. Everything logical told her to go home, to process what had happened in familiar surroundings. But something deeper, more instinctive, made her shake her head. "I'd like to see where you live." "If that's okay." "More than okay," Alexander said softly. The drive to Alexander's penthouse took them through the heart of the financial district, where glass towers stretched toward the clearing sky like modern cathedrals. Grace pressed her nose to the window, watching the city she'd lived in her entire life transform into something foreign and glittering. "Nervous?" Alexander asked, noticing her silence. "Terrified," Grace admitted. "But also curious. I've never seen how the other half lives." "The other half lives in isolation," Alexander said quietly, his voice carrying an unexpected sadness. "Beautiful, expensive isolation." Alexander's penthouse occupied the entire top floor of one of the city's most exclusive buildings, with a private elevator that required a special key to access. As the doors opened directly into his living space, Grace stepped into a world that seemed pulled from a luxury magazine. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around 3 sides of the apartment, offering a breathtaking panoramic view of the city below. The furniture was sleek and modern, all clean lines and expensive fabrics, but Grace noticed immediately how impersonal it felt. "Wow," she breathed, walking slowly toward the windows. The city sparkled beneath them like a carpet of stars, still glistening from the rain. "It's beautiful." "But empty," Alexander said, loosening his tie as he watched her explore. "I've lived here for 5 years, and I've never felt like it was home." Grace turned to study him, this powerful man who suddenly seemed lost in his own space. What would make it feel like home? Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. "I don't know. I've been so focused on work, on building the company, that I never learned how to build a life." The vulnerability in his voice made Grace's chest tighten. She walked back to him, stopping just close enough to see the exhaustion etched in his features. "Alexander, when was the last time you just..." relaxed. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. I don't remember. Even tonight, even knowing the company is safe now, I can feel my mind already racing ahead to tomorrow's problems. Grace made a decision that surprised even her. Reaching up, she began loosening his tie the rest of the way, her fingers gentle against his throat. Well, Mr. Cain, lucky for you, your wife is an expert at taking care of stressed customers. Alexander's breath caught at her touch, but he didn't pull away. Is that what I am? A stressed customer? I don't know, Grace said honestly, her hands moving to the buttons of his suit jacket. What do you want to be? The question hung between them, heavy with possibility. Alexander's hands came up to cover hers, stilling her movements. Grace, you don't have to. I know I don't have to, she said softly. But you looked like you could use some kindness tonight. Let me help. Alexander's eyes searched her face, looking for something Grace wasn't sure she understood. Whatever he found, there made his shoulders finally relax. Okay. Grace helped him out of his jacket and led him to the massive couch that faced the windows. Sit, she commanded gently. And to her surprise, this man who probably gave orders all day followed hers without question. I'm going to make you some tea, Grace announced, heading toward what she assumed was the kitchen. And you're going to tell me 3 things about Alexander Cain that have nothing to do with business. The kitchen was a chef's dream, all granite countertops and professional-grade appliances that looked like they'd barely been used. Grace found tea bags in a cabinet and put the kettle on, marveling at how surreal it felt to be making tea in a billionaire's kitchen while wearing a wedding ring she still couldn't quite believe was real. 3 things, Alexander called from the living room, amusement finally creeping into his voice. That's harder than you might think. Then start with 1, Grace called back, searching through cabinets until she found mugs. I'm terrified of butterflies, Alexander admitted, and Grace could hear the smile in his voice. She laughed, nearly dropping the mug she was holding. Butterflies. Seriously? Dead serious. When I was 7, my class went to a butterfly conservatory for a field trip. One landed on my nose, and I screamed so loud they had to call my grandfather to come pick me up. Grace returned to the living room carrying 2 steaming mugs, still grinning. Okay, that's adorable. What else? Alexander accepted the tea gratefully, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. I wanted to be a teacher when I was young. Elementary school. I used to set up my stuffed animals and give them lessons about dinosaurs and space. What changed? Grace asked, settling beside him on the couch, close enough that their knees almost touched. Reality, Alexander said simply. My parents died when I was 12. Grandfather needed me to understand the business, to be ready to take over someday. Teaching became impractical. Grace felt a pang of sadness for the boy who'd had to grow up too fast. And the 3rd thing? Alexander was quiet for so long that Grace thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I've never brought anyone here before. You're the first person other than staff to see this place. Grace's heart did something complicated in her chest. Why? Because it never felt worth sharing, Alexander said, meeting her eyes. But tonight, seeing it through your eyes, it feels different. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping tea and watching the city slowly quiet below them. Grace found herself studying Alexander's profile, noting the way the tension had finally left his shoulders, how much younger he looked when he wasn't carrying the weight of the world. Can I ask you something? Alexander said eventually. Of course. Why did you really say yes tonight? And don't say it was for the money. I could tell that wasn't the real reason. Grace considered her answer carefully. Do you remember, about 6 months ago, there was a night when the restaurant was almost empty because of that terrible snowstorm? Alexander nodded slowly. You were the only customer who stayed. You could have left, gone somewhere warmer and more convenient, but you didn't. And when I mentioned that I was worried about getting home safely, you had your driver wait to make sure I made it to my apartment okay. You probably don't even remember it. I remember, Alexander said quietly. That's when I realized you weren't like the other customers. You saw people, not just service. Tonight, when you asked for my help instead of demanding it, when you said please, Grace trailed off, searching for the right words. I guess I recognized the person I'd been hoping was real all along. Alexander set down his mug and turned to face her fully. Grace, I need you to know something. This marriage, it started as a business necessity, but sitting here with you now? He paused, running a hand through his hair. I can't remember the last time I felt this calm. This happy. Grace's breath caught. Alexander, I'm not asking for anything, he said quickly. I just wanted you to know that whatever this becomes, tonight has been the best night I've had in years. Grace looked into his eyes, seeing sincerity and hope, and something that made her pulse quicken. Making another impulsive decision that would have shocked her 12 hours ago, she leaned forward and kissed him softly. This kiss was different from the ones at the restaurant and courthouse. Those had been desperate, necessary. This one was a choice, gentle and sweet, and full of possibility. When they broke apart, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. I have a guest room, he said quietly, or you can stay here with me. Whatever feels right to you. Grace smiled, feeling more certain than she had all night. I'd like to stay with you, if that's okay. More than okay, Alexander whispered, echoing his words from earlier. Grace woke slowly, consciousness drifting back like morning mist lifting from a lake. For a moment, she couldn't place where she was. The bed was impossibly soft, the sheets silkier than anything she'd ever felt, and sunlight was streaming through windows that were far too large for her tiny apartment. Then memory crashed back like a tidal wave, and she bolted upright with a gasp. The wedding. The kiss. Alexander Cain. She was in Alexander's bed, wearing one of his soft cotton t-shirts that fell to her knees, while he had slept on top of the covers fully clothed, ever the gentleman. He was still asleep beside her, his dark hair tousled, and his face peaceful, in a way she'd never seen during his visits to the restaurant. In sleep, he looked younger, the weight of responsibility temporarily lifted from his shoulders. Grace's hand went automatically to her left ring finger, where her grandmother's diamond caught the morning light and sent tiny rainbows dancing across the white walls. It was real. All of it was real. Moving carefully so as not to wake Alexander, Grace slipped out of bed and padded barefoot to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The view in daylight was even more spectacular than it had been the night before. The entire city spread out beneath them, from the financial district's glass towers to the harbor where boats bobbed like toys in the distance. Beautiful, isn't it? Alexander's voice, rough with sleep, came from behind her. Grace turned to find him sitting up in bed, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. It's incredible. Do you ever get used to it? I thought I had, Alexander said, standing and moving to join her at the window. But seeing your reaction reminds me why I chose this place. They stood side by side, both of them awkward in the morning light. The intimacy of the night before felt fragile now, as if it might shatter at the wrong word or gesture. I should probably call in sick to work, Grace said, then laughed at the absurdity of it. Though I suppose I don't exactly have a job to call in sick to anymore. Alexander's expression grew serious. Grace, about your job, about everything that's changed, I want you to know you don't have to depend on me financially. We can set up accounts in your name, make sure you have complete independence. Grace turned to study his face, noting the careful way he was choosing his words. You're trying to give me an escape route. I'm trying to give you choices, Alexander corrected. This happened so fast, and I don't want you to feel trapped. Before Grace could respond, Alexander's phone rang with the sharp trill that seemed to pierce right through the peaceful morning. He glanced at the screen and winced. My assistant, he explained apologetically. I need to take this. Alexander Cain, he answered, his voice immediately shifting to the authoritative tone Grace recognized from his business calls at the restaurant. Grace couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but she watched Alexander's expression grow increasingly tense as he listened. What do you mean, leak to the press? Alexander demanded, running his free hand through his hair. How could they possibly know about the wedding already? Grace's stomach dropped. Of course. In her nervousness about the ceremony itself, she'd forgotten about the other diners at the restaurant, the ones who'd had their phones out during Alexander's proposal. No, absolutely not, Alexander was saying. Cancel all my morning meetings and get legal on the phone. I want to know our options for... He paused, listening. Then his face went pale. They have photos? Grace sank into a nearby chair, reality crashing down around her. She'd been so caught up in the romance of it all that she'd forgotten this was Alexander Cain, one of the most closely watched men in the city. Their midnight wedding wouldn't just be gossip. It would be front-page news. I understand, Alexander said finally. Give me an hour to figure out how we want to handle this. Then we'll call a press conference. He ended the call and turned to Grace with an expression of profound regret. I'm so sorry. I should have thought about this. Should have prepared you. How bad is it? Grace asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Alexander showed her his phone, pulling up a news website. The headline made her breath catch. Billionaire's midnight marriage. Cain weds mystery waitress, hours before inheritance deadline. Below the headline was a photo that made Grace's cheeks burn. It was from the restaurant, capturing the exact moment Alexander had dropped to one knee, with Grace's shocked face clearly visible above him. Her waitress uniform was unmistakable, and the photographer had managed to catch her expression of complete bewilderment. Oh God, Grace whispered, reading the article's opening lines. They make it sound like some kind of business transaction. Because that's what it was, Alexander said quietly, sitting down across from her. At least, that's what it started as. But Grace, if you want to walk away right now, I'll make sure you're protected. New identity, relocation, whatever you need. Grace looked up from the phone, studying his face. Is that what you want? For me to walk away? What I want, Alexander said carefully, is for you to be happy. If this circus is going to make your life miserable. What if I don't want to walk away? Grace interrupted, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. Alexander's eyes widened. You want to stay? Even knowing what this means? Grace stood up, moving to the window again as she tried to process her feelings. Alexander, in less than 12 hours, you've shown me more kindness and respect than most people have in years. Yes, this started as a business arrangement, but last night... She turned back to him. Last night felt real. It was real, Alexander said immediately, standing as well. Grace, everything I said last night, everything I felt, that was all real. Then we'll figure out how to handle the press together, Grace said, decision made. But I have one condition. Anything. I want to meet your grandfather. Alexander's face lit up with surprise and something deeper, gratitude mixed with hope. He's going to love you. How can you be so sure? Alexander moved closer, taking her hands in his. Because he's the one who taught me that the measure of a person isn't their bank account or their connections, it's their character. And Grace, you have the strongest character of anyone I've ever met. Grace felt tears prick her eyes. I'm scared, Alexander. I don't know how to be married to someone like you. I don't know how to handle reporters or society events or—" "Hey," Alexander said softly, tilting her chin up so she met his eyes. "You don't have to handle any of that alone. We're a team now, remember?" "A team," Grace repeated, testing the words. They felt good. Solid. "I like that." Alexander's phone rang again, and he glanced at it with annoyance. "That's probably legal calling back. I need to deal with this, but Grace—" "Go," Grace said, managing a smile. "Handle your business empire. I'll be here." "You'll be here," Alexander repeated, as if he couldn't quite believe it. "I'll be here," Grace confirmed. As Alexander moved away to take the call, Grace returned to the window, watching the city wake up below. Somewhere down there, people were reading about her, judging her, making assumptions about who she was and why she'd married Alexander Cain. The thought terrified her, but it also sparked something unexpected: determination. Let them judge. She knew why she'd said yes, and more importantly, she was beginning to understand why she wanted to stay yes. 2 hours later, Grace found herself in the back of Alexander's limousine, heading toward Cain Industries' corporate headquarters for what his publicist had called damage control. She'd traded Alexander's t-shirt for one of his dress shirts and a pair of slacks that had to be rolled up at the ankles, since they hadn't had time to stop at her apartment for her own clothes. "You don't have to do this," Alexander said for the 3rd time, his hand warm and reassuring over hers. "I can handle the press conference alone." "We're a team, remember?" Grace replied, though her stomach was churning with nerves. "Besides, hiding from them will only make things worse." The limousine pulled up to a gleaming glass tower that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the sky. Grace had seen the Cain Industries building before, of course, but she'd never imagined she'd be walking through its front doors as the CEO's wife. As they stepped out of the car, camera flashes exploded around them like lightning. Reporters shouted questions over each other, their voices blending into an incomprehensible roar of noise and aggression. "Mr. Cain, is it true you married your waitress to secure your inheritance? Grace, how long have you been planning this? Alexander, was this marriage arranged by your lawyers?" Grace instinctively moved closer to Alexander, who wrapped a protective arm around her shoulders and guided her swiftly through the crowd. She kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, trying to ignore the invasive camera lenses, and shouted questions that felt more like accusations. The building's lobby was a sanctuary of marble and steel, with soaring ceilings and abstract sculptures that probably cost more than Grace's annual salary. Security guards ensured the reporters stayed outside, while Alexander led Grace to a private elevator. "That was awful," Grace breathed as the elevator doors closed, finally allowing her to slump against the wall. "It gets easier," Alexander said, though his jaw was tight with tension. "I'm sorry you had to experience that." The elevator opened directly into Alexander's office, which occupied the entire top floor of the building. If Grace had thought his penthouse was impressive, this was overwhelming. The space was vast and elegant, with windows offering a commanding view of the entire city. Awards and photographs lined the walls, chronicling the Cain family's business legacy. Alexander, a woman in her 50s, with perfectly styled gray hair and a crisp business suit, hurried toward them, clutching a tablet and looking frazzled. "Thank God you're here. The phones haven't stopped ringing, and the board is in emergency session, and—" She stopped short when she noticed Grace, her eyes widening. "Margaret, this is my wife, Grace," Alexander said calmly. "Grace, meet Margaret Walsh, my assistant, and the person who actually runs this company." Margaret's mouth opened and closed several times before she managed to speak. "Your wife?" "Right. Of course." She shook her head as if clearing it, then extended her hand to Grace with a professional smile. "It's lovely to meet you, Mrs. Cain." "Mrs. Cain." Grace still wasn't used to hearing that name applied to her. Please, call me Grace. And thank you for arranging everything so quickly. The press conference is set for 1 o'clock, Margaret said, consulting her tablet. Legal has prepared a statement, and PR wants to coach you both on potential questions. Also, your grandfather has been calling every 10 minutes since the news broke. Alexander's expression softened. How is he? Delighted, from what I can tell, Margaret said with a genuine smile. He wants to meet Grace as soon as possible. We're planning to visit him after the press conference, Alexander said, glancing at Grace for confirmation. She nodded, nervous but eager to meet the man who had shaped Alexander into the person he'd become. The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation. Grace was introduced to a parade of lawyers, publicists, and executives, all of whom seemed to regard her with a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed concern. She understood their skepticism. From their perspective, she was a complete unknown who had somehow managed to marry their CEO overnight. The media coach, a sharp-eyed woman named Victoria, was particularly intense. The key is to stay calm and unified, she explained, pacing back and forth in front of Grace and Alexander. Don't let them bait you into emotional responses. Stick to the prepared statements and always present a united front. What if they ask about the inheritance? Grace asked. You acknowledge that the timing was influenced by family circumstances, but emphasize that your relationship has been developing over time, Victoria replied smoothly. You don't have to lie, but you don't have to give them every detail either. Grace felt sick. The idea of reducing her complex feelings to sound bites and strategic messaging made everything feel cheap and calculated. But Alexander seemed to sense her discomfort, reaching over to squeeze her hand. We'll get through this, he murmured. Just remember why we're doing it. At precisely 1 o'clock, they walked into the corporate conference room that had been converted into a makeshift press room. The space was packed with reporters, cameras, and equipment, all focused on the small podium where Grace and Alexander would make their statement. Alexander stepped up to the microphone first, his voice steady and authoritative. Thank you all for coming. As you're aware, Grace and I were married last night in a private ceremony. We're here today to address some of the speculation and misinformation that has been circulating. He paused, his eyes finding Grace's in the crowd. Grace Parker, now Grace Cain, is an extraordinary woman who I've had the privilege of knowing for several years. Our relationship developed naturally over time, and while the timing of our wedding was influenced by family circumstances, our feelings for each other are genuine and deep. Grace stepped forward, her heart pounding so hard she was sure the microphones would pick it up. I understand that our story might seem unusual, she said, her voice stronger than she'd expected. But sometimes, life doesn't follow the timeline we expect. What matters is that Alexander and I chose each other, freely and completely. The reporters immediately erupted with questions. Grace, how do you respond to accusations that you're a gold digger? Alexander, is it true you've never had a serious relationship before this? What's your prenup arrangement? Alexander's hand found the small of Grace's back, a steadying presence as she fielded the invasive questions with as much grace as she could muster. She found herself drawing on the same skills she'd used for years, dealing with difficult customers at the restaurant, staying calm, professional, and refusing to take the bait when reporters tried to provoke her. Our relationship is built on mutual respect and genuine affection, Grace said in response to the gold digger question. I didn't marry Alexander for his money. I married him because he's a good man who treats people with kindness and dignity. When a particularly aggressive reporter pressed about the inheritance, Alexander stepped in smoothly. My grandfather's wishes reflect his lifelong belief in the importance of family and commitment. Grace and I are honored to carry forward his legacy together. After 30 minutes that felt like hours, Alexander brought the conference to a close. Thank you for your questions. Grace and I ask for privacy as we begin our marriage, and we look forward to building a future together." As they left the podium, Grace felt drained, but oddly proud. She'd survived her first encounter with the media circus that was apparently part of her new life, and she hadn't fallen apart or said anything she'd regret. "You were incredible," Alexander said as soon as they were back in his office. "I've never seen someone handle their first press conference so well." "I felt like I was going to throw up the entire time," Grace admitted. "You didn't show it," Alexander said with admiration. "Grace, I know this is overwhelming, but you handled yourself like you were born for this." Margaret appeared in the doorway, beaming. "Your grandfather just called. He says to bring Grace by immediately. He can't wait another minute to meet the woman who's captured his grandson's heart." Grace felt a flutter of nerves mixed with anticipation. After everything that had happened in the last 24 hours, meeting Henry Cain felt like the most important test of all. The Cain family estate sat on 50 acres of perfectly manicured grounds just outside the city, its Georgian colonial architecture speaking of old money and established power. As their car wound up the tree-lined drive, Grace pressed her nose to the window, taking in gardens that looked like they belonged in a museum and fountains that sparkled in the afternoon sunlight. "It's beautiful," she breathed, then glanced at Alexander nervously. "Is this where you grew up?" "After my parents died, yes," Alexander confirmed, his voice soft with memory. "Grandfather turned the East Wing into a private apartment when I moved in. He said a 12-year-old boy needed space to be loud and messy without disturbing the staff." Grace could picture it, a grieving child rattling around in this magnificent house, being raised by a grandfather who clearly loved him enough to sacrifice his own comfort for a boy's needs. The image made her heart ache with tenderness for both of them. The car stopped in front of a grand entrance, where a woman in her 60s waited with a warm smile. She had silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and kind eyes that reminded Grace immediately of Alexander's. "That's Mrs. Henderson," Alexander explained as they got out. "She's been taking care of this place and our family for 30 years. "Master Alexander," Mrs. Henderson said, pulling him into a motherly hug despite his protests about being too old for such treatment. "And you must be Grace. My dear." He's been beside himself with excitement since the news broke. Grace found herself enveloped in a hug that smelled like vanilla and cinnamon, immediately making her feel welcomed and at ease. "It's wonderful to meet you, Mrs. Henderson. Call me Helen, dear. Anyone who can make this stubborn man smile the way he has been today is family to me." They were led through hallways, lined with family portraits and antique furniture that spoke of generations of Cain history. Grace tried not to gawk, but everything was so beautiful and formal that she felt like she was touring a historical monument rather than visiting a home. "Don't let the fancy surroundings intimidate you," Helen whispered conspiratorially as they approached a set of double doors. "Henry Cain is the most down-to-earth man you'll ever meet. Just remember that." Alexander knocked softly before pushing open the doors to reveal a spacious library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and comfortable leather chairs arranged around a fireplace. Afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating thousands of volumes and creating a warm, scholarly atmosphere. "Grandfather," Alexander called softly. "About time," came a voice from behind one of the tall stacks. A moment later, Henry Cain appeared, and Grace was struck immediately by how much Alexander resembled him. Henry was in his 80s, but moved with surprising vigor, his silver hair neatly combed, and his blue eyes bright with intelligence and warmth. "So, you're the young woman who's turned my grandson's world upside down," Henry said, approaching Grace with a smile that completely transformed his face. Despite the formal setting and his obvious wealth, there was something immediately approachable about him. I think he might have done that to mine as well, Grace replied, finding herself smiling back despite her nerves. Henry laughed, a rich sound that filled the library. I like her already, Alexander. She's got spirit. Grandfather, I'd like you to meet my wife, Grace, Alexander said formally. But Grace could hear the pride in his voice. Wife, Henry repeated, shaking his head in amazement. When I set that condition in my will, I honestly thought you'd never meet the deadline. You've always been too focused on work to pay attention to matters of the heart. Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks. Mr. Cain, I hope you don't think, the timing might seem. My dear girl, Henry interrupted gently. May I call you Grace? Of course. Grace, I've been watching my grandson for 35 years. I've seen him with business partners, with the women his various matchmaking friends have tried to set him up with, even with that dreadful Victoria woman who left him at the altar yesterday morning. Henry's eyes twinkled. I have never, in all those years, seen him look at anyone the way he looked at you during that press conference. Grace glanced at Alexander, who was studying his shoes with obvious embarrassment. You watched the press conference? Watched it? I had Helen record it so I could watch it 3 times, Henry said with obvious delight. The way you handled those vultures was magnificent, and more importantly, the way you two looked at each other. He trailed off, shaking his head. That's not something you can fake, no matter what the cynics might say. Henry gestured for them to sit in the comfortable chairs arranged around the fireplace. Grace found herself between the 2 Cain men, noting how similar their mannerisms were despite the 50-year age gap. Tell me about yourself, Grace, Henry said, settling back in his chair. And please, don't give me the polite social answer. Tell me who you really are. Grace took a deep breath, deciding to be completely honest. I'm nobody special, Mr. Cain. I grew up in a working-class family, put myself through college waiting tables, and I've been working at Skyline Restaurant for 3 years to help pay for my mother's medical bills. Until yesterday, the most exciting thing in my life was getting double shifts during the holidays. And what do you want from life? Henry asked, his voice gentle but probing. Grace considered the question seriously. I want to matter. I want to help people, to make a difference somehow. I studied journalism because I believed stories could change things. But I've been too busy surviving to pursue that dream. Henry nodded approvingly. And now? What do you want now that your circumstances have changed so dramatically? Grace glanced at Alexander, who was watching her with an expression of intense interest. I want to figure out how to be worthy of the chance I've been given. Your grandson saved my life last night, in more ways than one. I want to find a way to deserve that gift. My dear, Henry said softly, you saved his life too. Alexander has been drifting for years, brilliant at business, but lost when it comes to living. In one night, you've given him something I've been trying to give him for decades, a reason to build a life instead of just managing one. Alexander cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with being discussed like he wasn't in the room. Grandfather, hush, Henry said firmly. I'm not finished. He turned back to Grace. I want you to know that regardless of how this marriage began, you have my complete support. More than that, you have my blessing and my hope that you'll both have the courage to let this become something real and lasting. Grace felt tears prick her eyes. Thank you. That means more to me than you know. Henry reached over and patted her hand with surprising gentleness. Now, I believe Helen mentioned something about tea and cake, and I want to hear all about how this stubborn grandson of mine finally worked up the courage to propose, even if it did take a family emergency to motivate him. As Helen appeared with an elaborate tea service, and Henry began regaling them with embarrassing stories from Alexander's childhood, Grace found herself relaxing completely for the first time since waking up that morning. This wasn't the intimidating patriarch she'd expected, but a kind, intelligent man who clearly loved his grandson deeply and was willing to extend that love to her. When Alexander excused himself to take an urgent business call, Henry leaned closer to Grace with a conspiratorial expression. "I have something I want to show you," he said, rising from his chair and moving to an antique desk in the corner of the room. He returned with a small, leather-bound photo album. "Alexander's grandmother," Henry explained, opening to the first page. The photograph showed a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, wearing a simple dress and standing in what looked like the estate's garden. Her name was Margaret. We called her Maggie. She was a teacher when I met her, came from a family much like yours. Grace studied the photograph, struck by something familiar in the woman's expression. "She's beautiful." "She was extraordinary," Henry said softly. "Everyone said I was crazy to marry a schoolteacher instead of someone from our social circle. But Maggie taught me that love doesn't respect boundaries of class or wealth. She made me a better man, just like you're making Alexander a better man." He turned the page to show more photographs. Maggie teaching children, working in the garden, holding a baby who was clearly Alexander's father. In every image, she radiated warmth and authenticity. "Why are you showing me this?" Grace asked softly. Henry closed the album and looked at her seriously. "Because I want you to understand that you belong here, Grace. Not because you married into this family, but because you have the same spirit Maggie had, the same strength, the same grace under pressure, the same ability to see the person behind the position." Grace felt overwhelmed by his kindness and acceptance. "I'm scared I'll disappoint you. Both of you." "Impossible," Henry said firmly. "Do you know what Alexander told me when he called this morning to explain what had happened?" Grace shook her head. "He said, 'Grandfather, I finally understand what you meant about finding someone who makes you want to be worthy of them. That's not something a man says about a business arrangement, my dear. That's something a man says when he's falling in love." As evening approached and they prepared to leave the estate, Henry pulled Grace aside for a private moment, while Alexander was saying goodbye to Mrs. Henderson. "I have one request," Henry said, his voice serious but kind. "Give this a real chance. I know the circumstances were unusual, but I've seen the way you two look at each other. Don't let fear or outside opinions rob you of something that could be extraordinary." Grace nodded, emotion thick in her throat. "I want to. It's just everything is happening so fast." "The best things usually do," Henry replied with a gentle smile. "Love doesn't follow convenient timelines, my dear. It simply arrives when it's ready, whether we are or not." The drive back to the city was quiet, both Grace and Alexander lost in their own thoughts. The day had been overwhelming. The media attention, the press conference, meeting Henry, and Grace felt like she needed time to process everything that was changing in her life. "Penny for your thoughts?" Alexander asked finally, as they navigated the evening traffic. "I love your grandfather," Grace said immediately. "He's nothing like what I expected." Alexander smiled, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "He has that effect on people." "What did you expect?" "Someone cold and intimidating, I suppose. Someone who would see me as an intruder or a gold digger." Grace paused. "Instead, he made me feel like I belonged there." "You do belong there," Alexander said quietly. "Grace, I need you to know that everything my grandfather said was true. This might have started as a business arrangement, but what I'm feeling now—" He trailed off, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "What are you feeling?" Grace asked softly. Alexander was quiet for so long that Grace thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible over the sound of the traffic. "Like I've been sleepwalking through my life and you woke me up." Grace's heart did something complicated in her chest. Alexander. I know it's too soon to say things like that, he continued quickly. I know we barely know each other, and I know this situation is insane. But Grace, I can't pretend that what I felt today when you stood beside me at that press conference was just gratitude. Grace stared out the window, watching the city lights blur past as she tried to understand her own feelings. What happens now? I don't know, Alexander admitted. I've never been in a situation like this before. I've never had to figure out how to build a marriage while the whole world is watching. They were pulling up to Alexander's building now, the doorman already moving to open Grace's door. The thought of going back to that beautiful, impersonal penthouse made something twist in Grace's stomach. Can we go somewhere else? She asked impulsively. Alexander looked surprised. Where? I don't know. Somewhere normal. Somewhere we can just be ourselves without worrying about cameras or expectations or what anyone else thinks. Alexander studied her face for a moment, then leaned forward to give the driver new instructions. I know just the place. 20 minutes later, they were standing outside a small, family-owned Italian restaurant in a neighborhood Grace had never visited before. The place looked like it had been there for decades, with checkered tablecloths visible through the windows and the warm glow of simple lighting. How did you know about this place? Grace asked, as Alexander held the door open for her. I used to come here when I was in college, Alexander explained, when I needed to escape from being Henry Cain's grandson for a few hours. The owner, Mrs. Marcelli, has no idea who I am, and I've never corrected her. They were seated at a small table in the back corner, where the lighting was soft and the atmosphere intimate without being overwhelming. Grace found herself relaxing for the first time all day. The simple normalcy of ordering pasta and sharing a bottle of wine, making everything feel manageable again. Thank you, Grace said as they waited for their food. I needed this. Me too, Alexander admitted. I forgot how exhausting it can be to have every moment of your life analyzed and judged. Is that why you never had serious relationships before? Grace asked, then immediately worried she was being too personal. Sorry, you don't have to answer that. No, it's okay, Alexander said, taking a sip of wine. Partly, yes, but mostly because I never met anyone who made me want to deal with the complications. Until now. Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks. Alexander, I'm not trying to pressure you, he said quickly. I just want you to know where I stand. This morning I thought I was facing a marriage of convenience that we'd probably annul in a few months. Tonight, the idea of you leaving makes me panic. Grace looked across the table at this man, who 12 hours ago had been just a familiar customer, and tried to understand how everything had changed so completely. I'm scared, she admitted. Of what? Of disappointing you. Of not being enough for this life you're offering me. Of falling for you, and then having it all turn out to be a mistake. Alexander reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb brushing gently over her wedding ring. Grace, you could never disappoint me. And as for falling for me, he paused, meeting her eyes. I think I'm already there, so you wouldn't be alone. Grace's breath caught. You think you're falling for me? I think I fell the moment you said yes in that restaurant, Alexander said softly. Everything since then has just been me trying to catch up to what my heart already knew. Grace stared at him, seeing sincerity and vulnerability in his expression that took her breath away. This is crazy. Completely insane, Alexander agreed with a small smile. But Grace, sometimes the best things in life are a little crazy. Their food arrived, interrupting the moment, but not the feeling between them. As they shared pasta and talked about everything and nothing, Grace found herself studying Alexander's face when he wasn't looking, noting the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, the gentle way he insisted she try his dish, the unconscious protectiveness in the way he positioned himself between her and the other diners. "Can I ask you something?" Grace said as they lingered over dessert. "Anything. When you were watching me at the restaurant all those months, what did you see?" Alexander considered the question seriously. Someone who cared about doing her job well, even when customers were rude or dismissive. Someone who remembered regulars' orders and asked about their families. Someone who worked double shifts without complaining and still managed to smile genuinely. He paused. Someone real, in a world full of people pretending to be something they're not. Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "I never thought you noticed things like that." "I noticed everything about you," Alexander said quietly. "I just never thought I had the right to act on it. And now? Now you're my wife," Alexander said, his voice soft but certain, "and I'm hoping you'll give me the chance to deserve that title." As they walked back to the car hand in hand, Grace realized that for the first time since this whole adventure began, she wasn't thinking about escape routes or exit strategies. Instead, she was thinking about tomorrow and the day after that, and all the days they might have together if they were brave enough to let this become real. "Alexander," she said as they settled back into the car. "Yes?" "I think I'm ready to stop being scared and start being curious about what this could become." Alexander's smile was brighter than all the city lights combined. "I was hoping you'd say that." 3 weeks later, Grace stood in front of the mirror in what had become their bedroom, adjusting the neckline of a designer dress that still felt foreign despite the personal shopper's assurances that it was perfect for a corporate wife's first charity gala. The woman staring back at her looked polished and sophisticated, but Grace wasn't sure she recognized herself anymore. "You look beautiful," Alexander said from the doorway, his voice warm with admiration. He was stunning in his tuxedo, every inch the powerful CEO the business world expected him to be. "I look like I'm playing dress-up," Grace replied, smoothing her hands nervously over the silk fabric. "What if I say the wrong thing? What if I use the wrong fork or—" Alexander crossed the room in 2 quick strides, taking her hands in his and stilling their anxious movements. "Grace, you've been to 3 events with me already, and you've been magnificent every time. You have nothing to prove to anyone." Grace leaned into his touch, drawing strength from his presence. The past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind of adjustment, moving her few belongings into his penthouse, learning to navigate the constant media attention, and slowly beginning to understand what it meant to be married to one of the city's most powerful men. But through it all, Alexander had been patient, supportive, and increasingly affectionate in ways that made her heart race. "I just want to make you proud," Grace said softly. "You do," Alexander replied immediately, tilting her chin up so she met his eyes. "Every single day, you make me proud. The way you handled that investor dinner last week, how you charmed the mayor's wife at the museum opening, the questions you asked at the board meeting when I thought you were just observing. Grace, you're not just surviving in this world, you're thriving." Grace felt a flutter of warmth at his words. It was true that she'd been finding her footing more quickly than she'd expected. Her years of reading people and managing difficult situations as a waitress had translated surprisingly well to corporate social events, and her genuine interest in Alexander's business had led to insights that even surprised him. "Besides," Alexander continued with a mischievous smile, "tonight is special." "Special how?" Instead of answering, Alexander pulled a small jewelry box from his pocket. "I have something for you." Grace's eyes widened as he opened the box to reveal a stunning necklace, a delicate chain of white gold with a pendant that caught the light and threw tiny rainbows across the walls. "Alexander, it's beautiful, but you don't need to keep buying me things." "This isn't just a gift," Alexander interrupted, moving behind her to fasten the clasp. His fingers were gentle against her neck, sending shivers down her spine. Look closer at the pendant. Grace lifted the pendant to examine it more closely and gasped. It was a tiny star, but not just any star. It was engraved with coordinates. The exact location where we first met, Alexander explained, his voice soft against her ear. Table 12 at Skyline Restaurant. I had the jeweler created specifically for tonight. Grace turned in his arms, tears pricking her eyes. Why tonight? Alexander's hand settled at her waist, his expression serious but tender. Because tonight I want everyone to know that this isn't just a marriage of convenience anymore. I want them to see that I'm completely, hopelessly in love with my wife. Grace's breath caught. They'd been dancing around those words for weeks, growing closer every day but never quite crossing that final line. Alexander, I love you, Grace, he said, his voice steady and certain. I love your kindness, your strength, the way you make me laugh, the way you challenge me to be better. I love how you remember the names of every staff member in this building and how you cry during commercials with puppies. I love that you're brave enough to argue with me when you think I'm wrong, and generous enough to support me when I'm right. Grace felt tears spill over as the words she'd been afraid to acknowledge even to herself finally broke free. I love you too, she whispered. I think I started falling that first night when you trusted me enough to tell me about your grandfather, and I've been falling ever since. Alexander's smile was radiant as he leaned down to kiss her, soft and sweet and full of promise. When they broke apart, Grace rested her forehead against his, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they'd just confessed. So, Alexander said with a grin, ready to face the sharks? Grace laughed, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. With you, I'm ready for anything. The charity gala was being held at the Grand Metropolitan Hotel, and as their car pulled up to the red carpet entrance, Grace could see the usual crowd of photographers and reporters waiting. But for the first time since this whole adventure began, she wasn't dreading the attention. Remember, Alexander murmured as their door was opened. We're not performing anymore. We're just being ourselves. They stepped out of the car together, and Grace was struck by how natural it felt to take Alexander's offered arm, to smile at the cameras, not because she was supposed to, but because she was genuinely happy. The questions from reporters seemed less invasive now, more curious than malicious. Grace, how are you adjusting to married life? Are you planning to pursue your journalism career? Alexander, any plans for children? Grace handled the questions with growing confidence, her answers genuine rather than scripted. When a reporter asked about her future plans, she surprised herself with her response. I'm actually working with the Cain Foundation to develop a scholarship program for students from working-class families who want to pursue journalism, Grace said, glancing at Alexander with love and pride. We believe everyone deserves the chance to tell their story. Alexander squeezed her hand, his expression full of admiration. It was true. Over the past week, Grace had thrown herself into foundation work, bringing a passion and perspective that had reinvigorated the entire organization. Inside the ballroom, the evening proceeded like a dream. Grace found herself genuinely enjoying conversations with people she'd once found intimidating, her natural warmth and curiosity winning over even the most skeptical society matrons. When Alexander was pulled away for business discussions, she held her own with grace and intelligence that made him beam with pride from across the room. You're different tonight, observed Victoria Sterling, the woman who had left Alexander at the altar and who had cornered Grace by the champagne table with obvious hostile intent. Different how? Grace asked calmly, refusing to be baited. Happy, Victoria said, her voice sharp with something that might have been regret. You look at him like he hung the moon. Grace considered her response carefully. I look at him like I love him, because I do. Victoria's perfectly composed expression cracked slightly. You know, I thought I was saving us both from a loveless marriage. I never imagined he was capable of looking at someone the way he looks at you. Maybe he just needed someone who could see past the CEO to the man underneath, Grace said gently, finding that she felt more pity than anger toward this woman who had let fear cost her something precious. The conversation was interrupted by the evening's main event, the auction for the new children's hospital wing. Grace watched with growing excitement as various luxury items were bid on, the amounts reaching levels that still made her dizzy despite her new circumstances. Then Alexander took the stage as the evening's final speaker, and Grace felt her heart swell with pride as he addressed the crowd with passion and eloquence about the importance of healthcare for all children, regardless of their families' financial situations. "Before I close," Alexander said, his eyes finding Grace's in the crowd, "I want to introduce you to someone who has changed not just my life, but my understanding of what it means to use privilege responsibly. My wife, Grace Cain, has shown me that real strength comes not from power or wealth, but from compassion and the courage to stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves." The applause was thunderous as Alexander gestured for Grace to join him on stage. She walked toward him on unsteady legs, overwhelmed by the love and pride in his voice. "Grace has agreed to chair our new scholarship initiative," Alexander continued, wrapping an arm around her waist. "And tonight, we're pleased to announce that the Cain Foundation will be donating $5 million to establish permanent funding for this program." Grace turned to stare at Alexander in shock. This was the first she'd heard of such a massive donation. But his smile was warm and encouraging, and she realized he was giving her the resources to pursue the dream she'd shared with him weeks ago. As they left the stage together, Grace felt like she was floating. This wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was becoming something better than she'd ever imagined possible. $5 million, she whispered as they made their way back to their table. "It's just money, Grace," Alexander replied softly. "What you're going to do with it, that's what matters." 6 months later, Grace woke to sunlight streaming through the windows of their bedroom and the sound of Alexander humming in the shower. She stretched lazily, marveling at how completely their lives had intertwined, how natural it felt to wake up beside him every morning and fall asleep in his arms every night. The penthouse had been transformed since she'd moved in, where once everything had been pristine and impersonal. Now there were photographs scattered on tables, books stacked in comfortable piles, and small touches that made the space feel like a home rather than a showplace. Grace's favorite addition was the cozy reading nook they'd created by the windows, where she often curled up with manuscripts from scholarship applicants while Alexander worked on his laptop nearby. "Good morning, beautiful," Alexander said, emerging from the bathroom with a towel wrapped around his waist and water-still droplets gleaming on his shoulders. "Good morning yourself," Grace replied, pulling him down for a kiss that tasted like mint and promises. Even after all these months, the sight of him first thing in the morning still made her heart skip. "I have news," Alexander said, settling beside her on the bed, with an expression that was equal parts excitement and nervousness. "Good news or bad news?" "Potentially amazing news if you're open to it," Alexander replied, pulling out his phone and showing her an email. "The Times wants to interview you about the scholarship program. Not us, just you. They want to feature you as one of their Women Making a Difference profiles." Grace's eyes widened as she read the email. "They want to interview me? Are you sure they don't mean both of us?" "Nope, just you," Alexander said with obvious pride. "Grace, do you realize what this means? You've built something so significant that it's earning recognition completely independent of your connection to me." Grace felt a flutter of excitement mixed with nerves. The scholarship program had become her passion project, and seeing the first recipient starting college this fall had been one of the most rewarding experiences of her life. But national media attention still felt overwhelming. "What if I mess it up?" Grace asked, voicing her lingering insecurities. Alexander cupped her face gently, his eyes warm with love and confidence. "Impossible. Grace, you've testified before the State Education Committee, presented to the Foundation Board, and convinced 3 other major donors to create similar programs. You're not the scared waitress who married me in desperation anymore. You're Grace Cain, advocate, philanthropist, and the most capable woman I know." Grace leaned into his touch, drawing strength from his unwavering belief in her. "When you put it like that—" "I put it like that because it's true," Alexander said firmly. "And Grace, I want you to know that whatever you decide about this interview, whatever direction your career takes, I'll support you completely. Even if it means less time for corporate wife duties?" Grace asked teasingly. "Especially then," Alexander replied seriously. "I didn't marry you to turn you into some trophy wife. I married you because you're extraordinary, and I want the whole world to see what I see when I look at you." Grace felt tears prick her eyes at his words. The man who had once been content with a marriage of convenience had become her biggest champion, encouraging her to dream bigger and reach further than she'd ever thought possible. Their peaceful morning was interrupted by the arrival of Margaret, Alexander's assistant, who bustled in with her usual efficiency and a stack of papers that immediately put Alexander into work mode. "Sorry to interrupt," Margaret said, though her smile suggested she wasn't entirely sorry. "But we have a situation that requires immediate attention." "What kind of situation?" Alexander asked, already reaching for his clothes. "The Hartwell Industries deal. They're threatening to pull out unless we can guarantee certain environmental standards that our current suppliers can't meet." Grace watched Alexander transform from relaxed husband into sharp-focused CEO, his mind already racing through solutions and contingencies. It was fascinating to witness, and she'd never gotten tired of seeing him in his element. "I'll be in the office in 30 minutes, Alexander said, already mentally shifting into crisis management mode. "Actually," Grace said thoughtfully, "what if the solution isn't changing suppliers? What if it's helping your current suppliers upgrade their systems?" Both Alexander and Margaret turned to look at her with surprise. "The Cain Foundation has connections with environmental consulting firms through our other programs," Grace continued, warming to her idea. "What if we offered to subsidize the upgrades for suppliers who commit to long-term sustainability practices? It solves Hartwell's concerns, keeps your existing relationships intact, and creates a model other companies could follow." Alexander stared at her for a moment, then broke into a grin that made her pulse quicken. "Grace Cain, you're brilliant. It's just an idea." "It's a perfect idea," Alexander interrupted, pulling her into his arms and spinning her around. "Margaret, get the environmental team on the phone and set up a meeting with our top 3 suppliers for this afternoon." "Right away," Margaret said, though Grace caught her smiling as she hurried out to make the arrangements. "See?" Alexander said, setting Grace down but keeping his arms around her. "This is what I mean. You don't just support what I do, you make it better." Grace felt a warm glow of satisfaction at solving a complex business problem. But more than that, she felt the deep contentment that came from being truly seen and valued by the person she loved most. "Go save your deal," Grace said, straightening his tie with wifely efficiency. "I'll call the Times back about that interview." "You're going to do it?" "I'm going to do it," Grace confirmed, feeling more confident than she had in months. "It's time I stopped thinking of myself as lucky and started acknowledging that maybe I've earned this." Alexander's kiss was soft but intense, full of pride and love and promise. "I love you, Grace Cain." "I love you too, Alexander Cain." As Alexander left for the office and Grace settled at her desk to plan her day, she reflected on how much had changed since that desperate night at the restaurant. She'd thought Alexander was saving her from financial ruin, but the truth was much more complex. They'd saved each other, him from a life of emotional isolation, her from a future of unfulfilled potential. The scholarship applications spread across her desk represented dozens of young people who would get chances they'd never had before, and the Times interview would help expand the program even further. Grace picked up her phone to call the reporter back, ready to tell a story about second chances, unexpected love, and the magic that could happen when two people were brave enough to leap into the unknown together. Outside the windows, the city sprawled beneath them in all its chaotic beauty. Grace thought about all the stories unfolding in those buildings below. People falling in love, chasing dreams, taking chances that might change their lives forever. She and Alexander had started as one impossible story, and somehow they'd managed to write themselves a happy ending. No, Grace corrected herself as she dialed the number. Not an ending, a beginning. 1 year later, Grace stood at the podium of the Grand Metropolitan Hotel's ballroom, the same venue where she'd first felt truly confident as Alexander's wife, addressing a crowd of scholarship recipients, donors, and dignitaries. The annual Cain Foundation Scholarship Gala had become one of the city's most anticipated events, not for its glamour, but for its genuine impact on young lives. When I first stepped into this world, Grace began, her voice clear and confident, I thought success meant surviving without embarrassing myself. Tonight, looking at the 47 incredible students who will be starting college this fall through our program, I understand that real success means using whatever platform you've been given to lift others up. The applause was warm and genuine as Grace gestured to the scholarship recipients seated at the front tables. Their faces, bright with hope and determination, reminded her why this work mattered so much. These students represent every background, every dream, every story that deserves to be told. They're future doctors and teachers, journalists and engineers, artists and entrepreneurs. But most importantly, they're proof that talent exists everywhere. Opportunity doesn't. Alexander watched from the side of the stage, his face glowing with pride and love. The woman speaking wasn't the nervous waitress he'd married in desperation, nor was she simply the polished society wife she'd learned to be. This was Grace in her full power, passionate, articulate, and completely in her element. Before I close, Grace continued, I want to thank the man who taught me that the best way to honor an unexpected blessing is to share it. My husband, Alexander Cain, didn't just give me a new life. He gave me the courage to create the life I was meant to live. Their eyes met across the crowd, and Grace felt the same flutter of excitement she'd experienced that first night when he'd asked her to pretend they were together. Except now, nothing was pretend. Their love was real, tested, and stronger than either of them had dared to hope. As the evening wound down and the last guests departed, Grace and Alexander found themselves alone on the hotel's rooftop terrace, the city twinkling below them like a field of stars. Successful evening, Alexander said, wrapping his arms around her from behind, as she leaned against the railing. The best yet, Grace agreed, settling back against his chest. Did you see Maria Rodriguez's face when we announced her full ride to MIT? I thought she was going to faint. I was watching you, Alexander said softly, pressing a kiss to her temple. You were radiant up there, completely in your element. Grace turned in his arms, studying the man who had become her partner in every sense of the word. Do you ever regret it? The way this all started, Alexander's expression grew thoughtful. You mean, do I regret proposing to a stranger in a moment of desperation? Something like that. Alexander was quiet for a moment, then shook his head with a smile. Grace, If you asked me to design the perfect way to meet the love of my life, I never would have chosen a midnight emergency wedding to save a business deal. But looking back now, I can't imagine it happening any other way. Why not? Because any other way, I might have been too careful, too controlled, too afraid of looking foolish to take the risk, Alexander explained. Desperation stripped away all my defenses and forced me to be completely honest about what I needed. I needed you, Grace. I just didn't know it until that moment. Grace felt tears prick her eyes, happy tears that seemed to come more frequently these days. I needed you too. I just thought I needed financial security. And instead, I found home, Grace said simply. I found the person I was meant to become. Alexander's smile was soft and wondering, as if he still couldn't quite believe their good fortune. Mrs. Cain, would you do me the honor of dancing with me? Without cameras or audiences, or any agenda other than the fact that I love you. Grace laughed, the sound echoing off the buildings around them. Mr. Cain, I thought you'd never ask. They swayed together under the stars, with only the distant sounds of the city as their music. Grace thought about the scared young woman who had said yes to a stranger's desperate proposal, and the confident woman she'd become through love, support, and the courage to embrace an impossible chance. Grace, Alexander said softly, I have something to tell you. Grace pulled back to look at him, noting the nervous excitement in his expression. What is it? The Times interview you did last month? It's been nominated for a Pulitzer Prize in feature writing. Grace's mouth fell open in shock. That's impossible. I'm not even a real journalist. You're not just a real journalist. You're an extraordinary one, Alexander said firmly. The piece about education inequality and the personal stories behind the scholarship recipients. Grace, it's been reprinted in dozens of papers, sparked policy discussions in 3 states, and inspired similar programs across the country. Grace felt dizzy with the magnitude of what he was telling her. The little girl who had dreamed of telling stories that mattered had grown up to do exactly that, in ways she'd never imagined possible. Whether you win or not, you've already accomplished something incredible, Alexander continued. You've used your voice to change lives, Grace. That's what real journalism is about. Grace thought about her mother, who had passed away peacefully 6 months earlier, surrounded by love and free from the financial worries that had dominated her life, thanks to the medical care Grace could now provide. Her last words had been about how proud she was of the woman Grace had become. You know what the best part is, Grace said, her voice thick with emotion. What? I'm not done yet. This is just the beginning. Alexander's kiss was soft and sweet and full of promise. Around them, the city hummed with life and possibility, with countless stories yet to be told, and dreams yet to be realized. As they made their way back down to the car that would take them home to their beautiful, love-filled life, Grace marveled at the journey that had brought them here. It had started with 5 desperate words, "Kiss me now, or I lose everything," and had become something neither of them could have imagined. She had kissed him, and instead of him losing everything, they had both found everything they'd never known they needed. What did you think of Grace and Alexander's story? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and on a scale from 0 to 10, what's your rating? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow all our story, and check out more romantic tales by clicking on the videos suggested at the end of this one.